This week, we're continuing our reading of Manly P. Hall's The Initiates of the Flame. We're going to discuss the Knights of the Holy Grail, King Arthur, the Round Table, and a host of other mythical things related to this story. Is it fact, fiction, allegory, something in between? And then we'll explore a relatively new article written by Dr. Russell Mole, who explores whether King Arthur was a real historical person. All this and more. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry. Here's your host, Brother Robert Johnson.
Welcome back to the show. This is episode number 647. I want to thank our contributors, fellows, producers, and legacy partners of the WCY podcast. Since July of 2011, the Whence Came You podcast has been regularly creating weekly Masonic education for anyone interested in Freemasonry and its kindred sciences. This is no small endeavor requiring hours of work each week on top of what we all have, kids, spouses, and work. If you visit our website, wcypodcast.com, you'll see a few ways to give, whether that's a PayPal subscription, Patreon, and even PayPal single gifts. Both Patreon and PayPal subscriptions have the same tiers. We've got those 4 tiers. I invite you to join us in producing the WCY podcast. In the last more than 10 years, Masonic education has come a long way. Is that a coincidence? I'm not sure. Let's keep this ship on the course. Thank you for your decision to join us, or for even considering it. And of course, you can help us out in other meaningful ways by purchasing from our shop, our bookstore, through our Amazon affiliate links, or even just by sharing the show with your friends and brothers. Now, if you are just joining us in this particular week after some time away, well, you're in for a treat. We are in the midst of reading Manly P. Hall's The Initiates of the Flame. Now, we began this 7 episodes ago. This is The Initiates of the Flame, Part 7. Very quickly, before we dive into that, I did want to mention once more at the top of the program that this week we are doing Camp Cornerstone. So if you have not registered yet, there might be a chance you can visit or come out. You can email campcornerstone2024@gmail.com if registration is closed. And maybe there's room for you somewhere, or they have an extra seat at the festive board. But I'll be there this weekend, and I'm very much excited about the entire experience. I just found out a good brother of mine, Brother Dave, is going to be out there with us at the Nordic Village. So very excited to see Brother David again. And I think it's going to be a great time, a great experience for all. Very much excited to hold some fellowship with everybody out there. And then, of course, August 17th, I'm just traveling to attend this famous cave degree down in Tennessee. Yeah, it's going to be awesome. Really excited. Heading down there with my good friend and brother, worshipful brother, I should say, Adam Rigdon, who has done amazing things out at Watoma Lodge. Very excited to have some windshield masonry with him and, just fellowship with everybody down there as well. So, yep, that's what's on the docket. I hope you're getting out there and traveling also. But with all that said, let's go ahead and get into this episode and the reading, The Initiates of the Flame by Manly P. Hall. Chapter number 6, Knights of the Holy Grail. Just before the chapter begins, on page number 62, we see a grail with a single gem, a flame protruding and burning from within, almost like the old depictions of a Masonic lantern or lamp. And underneath, the words, the Holy Grail, "See in this cup your own body, within which is the lifeblood of the Sun Spirit of the universe. Each day that we live, we perpetuate the Last Supper, and in all that we do, we drink again the blood of Christ, the life power of the cosmos." We begin the chapter thus. Before starting to take up the study of the Grail legends, it will be well for all who are interested to read those tales that are now listed under the heading of children's fairy tale stories. For example, the story of good King Arthur and his Round Table is a cosmic myth, and while there is little doubt that he, as a man, also lived, The real mystery, as in the story of the Christ, is not the literal tale but the great mystic or occult truth that is concealed under allegory and parable. It is the same with the story of Parsifal, which can never be really understood and appreciated until the student sees in the knight and latter king of the sacred cup his own spiritual development and the temptations he must also master if he would become a king of the Grail. In the Lohengrin, also the same truth is shown to the world. It is the path of initiation along which each must pass on his road to self-mastery. To every nation and in every tongue, sacred legends have been given to teach man the path he must follow. On the previous page, we see a sword driven through a stone. The stone lifted off the ground. We see 3 legs attached to the stone to lift it off the ground a few inches. The stone has a few cracks. The sword is plunged directly through the center. Over the hilt of the sword is draped a small black ribbon. The handle of the sword looks to be of scales, with a round pommel and perhaps a bird or dragon carved into the top. It also could be feathers. Under it, it says the stone and the sword. Whoever can draw this sword from this stone is the master of the universe. The blind Homer of the Greeks, who told of the wanderings of Ulysses, gave the same great truths to the world. The skalds of ancient Norway and Sweden and the prophets of the Jews used the same means, and everywhere, from the sacred books of the East to the legends of the American Indians, we find one great connected truth told to many different people in ways that were best suited for their development. Such a truth is the legend of the Round Table, given to King Arthur as a wedding gift. All true students know what wedding that was. Not of earth, but the wedding of the spiritual and intellectual within the initiate himself, when the spirit and the body are united eternally, each swearing to honor and protect the other. Of such a marriage was the union of Arthur and Guinevere in the legend of the king. Let us first of all consider the coming of Arthur the king. We read in the legend of Arthur regarding Merlin the magician, the wise man who, it is said, had charge of the coming king during his youth. Merlin represents the hand of the elder brothers, who, realizing that a great ego had come into the world, had consecrated themselves to the work of preparing him for his mission. It was under the direction of Merlin, the master mind, that the anvil and stone with the sword thrust into it were raised in the square of the city when it became necessary for a new king to be selected. It was he also who called all of the brave knights of the country and told them that the one who could draw forth the sword would be king of all the land. On the previous page, we see the rose, with a heart in the center and a cross on the top, with 5 leaves under the rose. The caption reads, "The Rosicrucian Rose." In this flower, which was painted upon the center of King Arthur's table, we see the soul of man, which through purification and service has blossomed out with all the grandeur of the initiate. Continuing on. And of all the knights in the land, Arthur, the half-grown boy, was the only one who could release the sword. There is a very wonderful mystery of the soul contained within that divine allegory. Let us read the letters that were engraved upon the sword. Quote, "Whoso pulleth out this sword of the stone and anvil is right wise king born of England." End quote. The cube stone is the body. It has been so symbolized for centuries, and today among the Masons the ashlar is the symbol of man. Experience is the anvil, and it is upon this anvil that the sword is tempered. The sword is spirit, and he who would be king in the true spiritual sense of the word must first show his divine power by freeing the sword of spirit from the casings of the lower man in the world. It is the same symbol as that latter used by Sir Galahad, the guileless knight, the personification of the purified man, who comes without a sword but who later arms himself with the sword of spirit that he draws from the cube block which was floating down the river past Camelot. I should interject here, within the text it says floating down the river, and then in parentheses it says of life. So it would read, but who later armed himself with the sword of spirit that he draws from the cube block, which was floating down the river of life past Camelot. Sir Galahad had the strength of 10 because his heart was pure, and the knight of today must follow in the same path. If you have read the story of King Arthur, you will remember how he was given Excalibur, the enchanted sword, how it came up out of the water held by a hand draped in white. Excalibur represents light and truth, which is the weapon of the true initiate. On the previous page we see the cup and the arrow or spear. Under the depiction we see the words, the sacred spear. This is the spear of passion that pierces the side of the Christ, the higher principle in man. But when in the hand of the pure of heart, this power can heal the very wound it caused. Continuing on. In England there still hangs on a courthouse wall the Round Table of King Arthur. In the very center of the table is a beautiful rose painted in natural colors. This symbol is that of the Rosicrucians, the ancient alchemists, and there is a direct connection between the legend of the British king and the ancient philosophers of fire. Now let us turn our attention for a moment to the history of the Holy Grail, or the cup from which Christ drank at the Last Supper and which was said to have caught his blood when he was dying upon the cross. Ancient legends tell us that this cup was made from a sacred stone which had been the crown jewel of Lucifer, the dynamic energy of the universe. It was said that the green stone had been struck from the crown of Lucifer by the archangel Michael during the famous battle in heaven. After the death of Christ, it is said that Joseph of Arimathea took up the sacred cup and the spear of the Passion and carried them into a distant land. He wandered with his sacred relics through Europe and is said to have finally died, and those who came after him, after many centuries of tribulation, carried the sacred relics to Mount Salvart in northern Spain, where they remained until Parsifal finally took the Grail and spear back to the east, where it is to be now preserved. It is around this cup and spear that the legends of Parsifal and King Arthur have been written, and it is through the study of this fact that we are able to better understand the mystery of the Great White Lodge, of which the Round Table of Arthur and the circular temple of the Knights of the Grail is a symbol. Although we no longer have the cup as a physical symbol, it is not gone from among us. And as in the days of old, the brave knights of the Round Table went out to fight for right, so those knights of today who belong to the Great White Brotherhood go out into the world in the name of truth and labor with mankind and seek to right the wrongs of the world. It is said that the knights of Arthur's court always fought for virtue and purity, and so did those who rode out of Mount Salvart. The Grail Cup is the symbol of the creative force of nature. It is also the symbol of the human race, which is slowly learning the mysteries of creation. Within this cup is the blood of Christ, that force which is transmuting the body into soul, fast or slowly as we give it greater or lesser opportunity. In the sacred spear we find symbolized again the creative force which, in the hands of Klingsor, the evil one, wounds and causes suffering, but which when held by the pure Parsifal heals the very wound that it caused. A great lesson is being taught to man through these allegories, but the average person is unwilling to stop and consider them. They do not realize that they themselves are the ones whom the elder brothers of humanity must use in the fight against the forces of evil. They do not realize that the dragons and ogres of the legends are their own lower natures which they must overcome. They do not see, in the hand-to-hand combat of the knights of the old, for a lady's hand the higher and lower man fighting for the soul within. The knight of today does not realize that the white armor that he wears is his own purified body, which is proof against all the attacks of vice and passion, but nevertheless, this is the meaning of the legend. His shield is truth, which is a perfect protection to the inner man. His strong right arm is the knowledge and spiritual power he has developed within, and the sword that he uses is the spiritual light with which the pure flame of the spirit fire dispels the darkness of ignorance and the demons of lust. The sacred spear and the cup which he serves are the two poles of the creative life force within, the development of which he gains as he daily serves his fellow men. Far from the uninitiated, the 12 elder brothers of mankind sitting around the circular table of the universe watch the knights in their battle of life, and the time comes when the student, having finished his work here, is liberated at the foot of the Grail. There the candidate stands robed from head to foot in the armor of spirit, and in the pure white of a body that has been cleansed. Then the cloth is lifted from the sacred cup, and he is illuminated by the light which would have killed him had he seen it without purification. He then takes his place among the knights of the Round Table and joins those who give up all and labor for humanity. When in sickness and in suffering we beg of the great unknown that he send us help, then indeed our knight comes to us as Lohengrin came to Elsa. When our loved ones pass into the great unknown, there stands the brother of the Grail, the invisible helper who through days of labor has earned the right to become a member of that great band of servers who gather around that table of the king. And while their bodies are asleep, still labor in their great search for light and truth, and pray for the day when they shall also become kings of the Holy Grail. That's it for the chapter. A couple of call-outs. In the beginning of the chapter, it calls to the somewhat, perhaps apparentness that King Arthur had lived. This is still debated whether or not the historical character of Arthur actually lived. The true King Arthur, likely some sort of Saxon, Germanic origin, but something else to call out here is that it doesn't matter. The idea is that we are following the sort of allegory, the teaching behind the stories, and what they represent. So their factual or historical basis is not necessarily something that's important unless the author is saying that they're literally real, which in this case, Hall kinda does, but not really, but kinda does. So it doesn't matter, but I feel it necessary to call that out just in the vein of historical and contextual accuracy. I found the rest of the chapter to be on point for Hall, namely the idea of all of these allegories and symbols as really just being personifications or what you might call, can you anthropomorphize an idea? Is that right? It seems that's what he does all the time, right? This is a very big callback to the idea of the occult anatomy of man, but here he is taking the Grail legend and placing it on top of the concept of man bettering himself through this fight to become a better man by equalizing the things inside you, those positive and negative forces. I look forward to reading any commentary you have anywhere the episode is posted, in particular in our Craftsman Plus Facebook group. Next week, we will continue with the reading with chapter number 7, and we'll go into something else that I think is pretty darn interesting. We have the mystery of the pyramid. Now, last week, when I was talking about reading this week's piece on the Knights of the Holy Grail, I said that perhaps we would have a little bit of history to go along with it, and I intend to give you just that, right now. So let's begin with the idea of King Arthur. King Arthur, or the Welsh Brenin Arthur, or the Cornish Arthur Gurnau, French Rui Arthur, is a legendary king of Britain, a folk hero, a central figure in medieval literacy tradition known as the Matter of Britain. In Welsh sources, Arthur is portrayed as the leader of a post-Roman Britain in battles against the Anglo-Saxons in the late 5th and 6th centuries. His name also occurs in some early Welsh poetic sources, and the legend of Arthur develops as a figure of international interest largely through the popularity of Geoffrey of Monmouth's fanciful, imaginative 12th century The History of the Kings of Britain. Geoffrey depicted Arthur as a king of Britain who defeats the Saxons and establishes this huge empire. Many elements and incidents that are now an integral part of the Arthurian story appear in Geoffrey's Historia, including Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, the magician Merlin, Arthur's wife Guinevere, the sword Excalibur, Arthur's conception at Tintagel, and his final battle against Mordred at Camlan, and a final rest in Avalon. The 12th century French writer, who later added Lancelot and the Holy Grail to the story, began the genre of the Arthurian romance that became a significant strand of medieval literature. Now, there's a ton to read about the historicity of Arthur. However, I think it was summed up best in a science article by Dr. Russell Mole, a science writer for IFL Science. And he writes in an article which I will link back in the show notes that King Arthur, the ruler of Camelot, champion of Britain, wielder of Excalibur, and seeker of the Holy Grail, is surely the stuff of legend. Now, before we move on, the title of this article is, Was King Arthur a Real Historical Person? We've all probably heard something of the mythical figure, but is there any reality behind this legendary king? So here we go. There are probably few in Western societies who have not encountered some aspect of his story through various media, from books to television shows to video games and so on. But despite the power of this apparently timeless mythological figure, there is one question that has caused consternation for scholars and the public alike. Was the legend of Arthur based on a real person? Unfortunately, despite there being many who believe there was a living, breathing king called Arthur, there is no historical evidence to support it. The legend of a story. To be sure, the story of Arthur has not been static. It has gone through various transformations and revisions over the centuries, whereby more of the mythical features we recognize today were added. So to understand the individual from an historical perspective, we have to go right back in time. Save for a few scattered references, we do not really hear any mention of Arthur until the 12th century CE. In his The History of Kings of Britain, the Welsh monk Geoffrey of Monmouth provides the first extensive account of the character's life. According to Monmouth, Arthur's story starts with a rather dark event when Merlin, another complex character with his own twisting legend, transformed King Uther Pendragon, certainly not a real person, into the likeness of the Duke of Cornwall. This was so Uther could spend the night with the Duke's wife, Yagerna. During this night, Arthur was conceived in the stronghold of Tintagel. From here, Arthur grows into a powerful leader who inherits the British throne and leads his people in various epic and bloody battles against Saxon invaders. He later spreads his kingdom to encompass Ireland, Iceland, Norway, and Gaul, but is eventually murdered by his nephew, Mordred. There is nothing in this account about Camelot, Lancelot, the Holy Grail, his sword, or the heroic and chivalric knights who attend the Round Table. These features were all added later by authors looking to make Arthur fit with romantic ideas of their time. This was probably a good move too, as a 6th century leader would have likely been less, knightly and far more brutal. Monmouth's story cannot be constructed as historical fact in any way. Even in his day, he was criticized for fabricating elements while mixing together pieces from various Welsh poems and sources. As such, the Arthur we get is less a coherent individual and more like a soup of stories blended together. But what about the poems that inspired Monmouth? Could they hint at a real person? Despite the dodgy grounds for the story of Arthur, there are some who argue that his narrative was inspired to a lesser or greater extent by some sort of 5th or 6th century leader who was captured in Welsh poetry. According to these claims, at the end of the Roman occupation, a leader emerged who led the Britons, who had mostly become Christian by this point, against pagan Saxon invaders. And this hero's name was Arthur, maybe, for instance, in a poem called Yggodin, written sometime between 540 and 640 CE. A fallen soldier is linked to another heroic figure called Arthur. Presumably, then, there was some contemporary figure who would have been sufficiently recognizable as to make this likening significant. In another poem from the same period, the monk Gildas recalled how a hero called Ambrosius Aurelianus had led the Britons to victory at a 6th century battle known as the Battle of Badon Hill. However, a few centuries later, another monk called Nennius described a different warrior called Arthur as having led the Britons in the battle, and 11 others too. It is possible that Nennius's account was one that inspired Monmouth's later histories, though we cannot be sure. Does this mean there really was a historical character called Arthur? Well, some like to think so, but it honestly doesn't look like it. As mentioned above, medieval chroniclers love to blend fact and fiction, and many of these accounts were created hundreds of years after the events they claim to describe. Still, there are many out there who hold a candle for the reality beyond the once and future king. Unfortunately, history is yet to provide us with anything solid to base that hope on. Again, a wonderful article here by Dr. Russell Mole, science writer, edited by Miss Laura Simmons. You can download a PDF comment of the article, or you can access it. It was published on February 27th, 2024. Again, I will have the article as a link in the show notes, and I hope you check it out and subscribe to their weekly newsletter. It's a great newsletter, and you get lots of great, awesome science content, which, as Masons, we should all be concerned with, right? We are charged to practice the 7 liberal arts and sciences. So check it out. That's it for this week. I hope I took you on an interesting adventure. I know I learned some things. I hope you did too. I hope I catch you all in Arizona if you're going to be there, out in Flagstaff. If not, we'll talk to you all next week. So, one more time before we let you go, I want to thank our contributors, fellows, producers, and legacy partners. If you're interested in how you can help support the WCY podcast, head on over to our website, wcypodcast.com, click on Support the Show, and read all about it. Now, until next week, stay on the level. For Whence Came You, I'm Robert Johnson. Take care.
You've been listening to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry with your host, Brother Robert Johnson. Be sure to join us for our next edition.
Worldwide Media.
Why, that's me, man. No, the